Hello listeners and welcome to the Montel Weekly Podcast, bringing energy matters in an informal setting. My name is Richard Sverrisson. Today we're talking policy, regulation and the Green Deal. I'm joined by Øyvind Vessia of Ørsted. A warm welcome to you, Øyvind.
Thank you, Richard. Nice to talk to you.
You're in Brussels at the moment, Øyvind. How are you coping with the COVID-19 crisis? What's the situation like in Belgium?
I think Belgium is pretty much under lockdown. We're all told to be at home and only go out for the most necessary errands. We're now, I think, in the third week, or perhaps it's fourth. It's a bad sign when you start losing count
exactly.
of how many days you've been inside. It's an interesting period, but I think we're keeping up pretty well.
Okay, absolutely. That's good to hear. And you're working from home, then I gather, Øyvind.
Yeah, that's a new way.
I wanted to talk about the Green Deal. In particular, I think there's been a lot of talk about that in the months, certainly prior to COVID-19. I think the coronavirus might have taken some of the impetus off that. But I think I'd like to start off by asking you, what's new about the Green Deal?
Yeah, so let's now not think about the COVID-19 and kind of just focus on the Green Deal for a moment. I think what is new is really the ambition and how fighting climate change is now pivotal point for other initiatives, while fighting climate change was more of it had to be part of a EU work program. But now you can see other initiatives coming out of the need to fight climate change. So you have, for example, the EU industrial strategy, which is very much linked to this. EU cohesion funding is now more through just transition mechanism. You also have environmental protection, biodiversity. These topics are all now linked into the Green Deal, as well as mobility and agricultural policy. And I've been in Brussels for many years. I still remember, for example, back under the second Barroso Commission, you could hear Connie Hedegaard, that was back then the Commissioner for Climate Action from Denmark. She was talking about a need for mainstreaming climate change mitigation. I don't think she kind of managed to make that happen, although that was her vision. But this is now really, really taking place.
So you mentioned the ambition there. That's something that's very new. I mean, in detail here, what is the ambitious nature of the package?
I would first perhaps emphasize the fact that this target of becoming net zero, so net zero means that Europe's emissions shall not be bigger than what we capture, either naturally through forest or through technology like CCS. This net zero ambition for 2050 is now been put into law. This is a big step forward. But linked to this, in terms of ambition, I think we also need to be appreciating the fact that the 2030 framework and the 2030 targets is now up for assessment. And I think if you're serious about net zero by 2050, you need to also be very serious about what happens in the next 10 years. Because, we have more or less reduced by a bit more than 20% greenhouse gas reductions over the last 30 years. And we now have 30 years to do the last bit. And I think we also know that the last stretch, the last 5 to 10% reductions will not be like the next incremental marginal 5 to 10%. Those last ones will be much tougher and harder. So I think it's really a good thing that we are now reassessing the 2030 target and see that in context of this net zero ambition.
Absolutely. I want to talk about the 2030 targets a bit later on. But in the Green Deal, I mean, are there some parts that are missing or some elements that are insufficiently covered, would you say?
That's a good question. I haven't been thinking that something has been missing. To me, it looks very comprehensive, ambitious, but realistic. But in terms of gaps, I haven't been thinking of anything in particular now.
Okay, so it's as you view it, it's fairly comprehensive then?
Absolutely.
It's the complete package?
Yeah.
And how will it impact energy companies, power and gas firms in particular?
That's a very good question. And I think that's a job of many to try to figure that out and and also, of course, policymakers making this happen. I think the best source that I've come over in terms of what this might mean is actually this report that the European Commission did back in 2018 called Clean Planet for All, or also just called the long-term strategy. It's a really long document, several hundred pages long, but it includes an assessment of the whole European economy and how Europe can become net zero and what it means for the different sectors and the different parts of the economy. I think the key finding there is that this net zero ambition can best happen through electrification. So we will see the use of electricity for most of our mobility needs, where we today use mostly fossil oil. Also heating and industry will be to a large extent electrified, and there today we use mainly fossil gas. But this electrification, of course, also means a huge increase in demand for electricity. And what this long-term strategy is seeing is more than a doubling in electricity consumption in less than in 30 years. So today in Europe, we're consuming around 3,300 terawatt hours, and this is increasing to around 7,000 to 8,000 terawatt hours in 2050. So, that's a tremendous increase in electricity demand, which also then, of course, needs to be matched by supply.
So, I mean, that's a huge demand for the product that companies such as yourselves, are producing, are generating. Huge possibilities certainly for power companies, maybe a little bit more challenging for those in the gas sector.
Yeah, I think that's probably a fair way of putting it. Just looking at offshore wind, which is the renewable technology that Ørsted is mostly most engaged with, this long-term strategy finds that 25% of the electricity supply is coming from offshore wind. And when you keep in mind that this is 8,000 terawatt hours in total, it actually means more than 400 gigawatts of offshore wind. And today we have less than 30. So, this is a tremendous increase. And of course, something that a company like Ørsted is very excited about.
So that's the sort of look back at what the Commission reported in 2018. But if we can move to this year and maybe to early next year, what's on the legislative timetable at the moment, Øyvind? Could you give us a brief look into, what's your agenda, what's going to keep you busy over the coming months?
Yeah, so in terms of legislation, 2020 will not give much. I think the main thing we have already seen with the climate law that was put forward in March. But later this year, we will see a very, very important piece, which is called this comprehensive plan for how Europe can increase its 2030 ambition. So here, the Commission has said that they're going to propose to increase the ambition to 50 or 55% greenhouse gas reductions by 2030, which is a pretty big increase compared to the 40% that was agreed previously. And this plan will really be showing how this is possible, but it will also show some indications of what sectors, what technologies, what infrastructure, and this will then be the basis for the revision of the framework that will come next year in 2021, which will be then, of course, also a very important process. But the basis will probably be put down by this impact assessment that we're expecting over the summer. And then after that, we also expect this offshore wind strategy, which is essentially trying to look into this gap, between the 30 or less than 30 gigawatt that we have today and the 400 plus that might be needed by 2050. That is about maritime special planning. How do you prioritize the space? It's about how do you get such build out running? Because I think here there's also a question of how do you actually manage this in a regulatory manner, also with combining this possibly with infrastructure. So building offshore wind together with transmission lines, which will be a very new thing.
Because you'd almost need an offshore grid in a way, and that's complicated when you have in very many national jurisdictions, coming together there.
Indeed, I think there you're really pointing to one of the tricky bits there. That this is out there in the sea. It is not something we have a lot of experience with, but I think the European Commission and the European Union, it's really there for enabling Europe to cooperate. So I think it fits perfectly with the agenda of the European Union, but it's certainly not going to be easy to harness all that potential.
Yes, because there is, in a way, a bit of an irony that a lot of, the policy that's formulated is on a national basis, but you need the regional assessment, the regional measures to come through, really, to make this a success.
Yeah, that's very true.
But I was also wondering, in light of the COVID-19 crisis and the outbreak, do you expect any sort of delays in the legislation this year? And we've already seen COP being postponed.
Yeah, I think at this moment it's very difficult to tell. I think it's really hard to judge how this COVID will kind of influence this process. But we spoke with the cabinet of Timmermans last week, and then the message was clear that they don't expect any particular delays in their agenda. But in relation to this pandemic, you see the council has called for an economic recovery package, which we know that the Commission is working on. And here we can, I think, expect that this will have a strong flavor of the Green Deal and the transition. So I think here you might see even some kickstarting in terms of funding and projects that are kind of kickstarting the green transition even earlier than what you would otherwise have expected.
So instead of a delay, if I understand you correctly, Øyvind, it could actually accelerate the green transition here.
Yeah, I don't want to speculate, but but certainly in terms of concrete money on the table, there might be big projects kicking off earlier than otherwise. Yeah.
Absolutely. The legislation will be put on the table, won't be decided till next year. But in the meantime, can we expect a lot of horse trading to occur in the remainder of the year?
Absolutely. Still, the budget, the multi-annual financing framework has not yet been agreed. And a big question there is, of course, the economy part and how can, things like the just transition mechanism fit into this, and how can you make sure that Eastern countries that don't have the same capabilities to reach net zero, how can they be coming along? So certainly a lot of discussions there also this year, for sure.
So it'll be a lot of work for you and for us journalists there, I think, to cover it all once we get out of this COVID-19 crisis. But I think also a key factor, which you already alluded to, Øyvind, is the 2030 targets and potential ETS reform. So tightening the cap, potentially. Do you see that happening?
I think it's very difficult to see an increase of the ambition for 2030 to 50 or 55% without touching the cap. Yeah. So I think that's definitely on the table. But I think it's many other elements of the ETS that is also here important to keep in mind.
Okay.
We have the MSR. The MSR was anyway up for review. You can see now how the COVID is impacting the EU ETS price. I think here you might also see a need to kind of make the EU ETS even more resilient so that you don't have the green transition stopping up because of other factors that is dragging things down. And perhaps I should also mention that in terms of reform of the EU ETS, for us producing renewable energy, but also being in the business of renewable hydrogen, we are a bit perplexed, for example, by the fact that if you're producing hydrogen from fossil fuels, you get free allowances. But if you're producing hydrogen from renewable electricity, you don't get any free allowances. So there are also other parts of the EU ETS there that can be fixed where, if you have the same products that you put on the market, there should be equal incentives.
Absolutely. That sounds a prime example of a disincentive towards the green transition.
Yeah.
But I think you already mentioned the price of carbon, which has been certainly very volatile. I think we're back up well above 20 now, but 20 euros a tonne. But we also see some dramatic falls in emissions as industrial demand and power generation falls in the EU. We saw big shift last year, and this year some, potentially that could continue. We could see some big downfall in emissions. Do you think that will have more of an impact on the legislative process and trying to tighten the gap or to force people to look at the MSR in a different way?
Yeah, I think that's evident that how this has been playing out and what is achieved will have an impact. It's already noticeable how the MSR has been very successful after it started operating in 2019. But I think we will probably learn from now how the COVID is impacting it to see how this can be improved even further. But it would be very strange if these, I mean, now we're essentially in a very big economic experiment, or an experiment in many parts of our economy, but also in terms of the EU ETS and the MSR, it's a very interesting experiment that we're looking at the moment. And it would be strange to not take the kind of learnings from that when we refine the system.
Absolutely. I mean, I'm also part of the ETS, or part of the discussion now is one of the most controversial aspects is this carbon border tax proposals. How do you see that discussion evolving?
That is tricky. What I've seen so far is that been talks about cement being a sector. And then I also have seen that there are discussions around the transmission lines for electricity around the borders of the EU, where you have unfair competition between generators that are outside the EU, where they don't pay any ETS allowances, then importing into the EU. So I guess in the kind of simplest form, that could be a carbon border adjustment put on such import of electricity. But of course, that can also go to much more substantial changes, which will be having much bigger impact than just looking at these borders around the EU in terms of electricity imports. Sorry.
So in particular, we're talking on the borders, on the eastern borders of the EU and southern.
Yeah, exactly. Correct.
Well, thank you very much, Øyvind, for a fascinating discussion. And I think obviously your schedule is going to be very full going forward. So it'll be very interesting to invite you back once we have some more clarity, or the picture's a little bit more clear at the end of the year or early next year. So thank you very much for being a guest on the Montel Weekly podcast today, Øyvind.
It was a pleasure. Thank you. And stay safe and sane, although you're inside.
Absolutely.
Thank you.
Likewise, Øyvind. All the best to you.
Thank you.
Listeners, remember to keep up to date with all our stories on Montel News, and follow us on Twitter, LinkedIn, and subscribe where you usually subscribe to podcasts. That's all from now. Goodbye.